Were the psychonauts correct and trips cause you to quite literally tune in? Well, recent research says yes. So there's a paper published just about a week ago that says that psilocybin causes your brain to tune with the environment. So what on earth does this mean, and how might it help with things like depression and anxiety? Today, I, a drug scientist, am going to explain this to you. So the first thing that you have to understand is this concept of desynchronization. So basically our brain works by having these like individual neurons in it, and the individual neurons all communicate with one another. And sometimes there's these like patterns of synchronized activity. So like different areas are all being activated around the same time, and there's like this synchronization of those neurons working together. Like picture it as like a synchronized swimming of synapses. And so those networks of activity are basically underlying a lot of things that we do. So there's like the somatomotor network, and these are the primary types of networks. So these are helping with things like integrating your senses with your motor movements. So allowing you to like hold crochet needles and be able to crochet or play sports or play the piano. Like it's integrating your senses together. And then there's these association networks, and these are things like the default mode network. And these are patterns of activity that underlie things like thinking. So like your internal world. And the default mode network is a big one. So there's this kind of synchronization of activity that is occurring when your mind is wandering. And this can be a good thing. So we see that it's linked to things like creativity. So you have these like neurons firing that are allowing you to like make connections between things. But then there's also problems associated with it. So for example, the default mode network is associated with things like ADHD. So people with ADHD might not be able to turn off the default mode network as much as they would like to. So it means that there's a lot going on in their brain that they are trying to listen to, and it's harder to potentially do things like focus. And so you have the primary ones, the ones that are driven by the external world, so things like the somatomotor one that are taking the information from your senses, and then you have more of the internal ones, so the association networks. Now on to the shrooms. So neuroscientists wanted to see what would happen to these networks if you gave people shrooms. They also gave them Ritalin. I'm not entirely sure why, and it wasn't really clarified in the study. There's a comparison there with Ritalin, but I'm not sure why they chose Ritalin. But they found that there were substantial differences after psilocybin. So they basically took 7 people who had never had shrooms before, and then they scanned their brains right before they got shrooms, scanned them right after they got shrooms, and then kept scanning them for like weeks after. And what they found was there was, quote, a massive disruption of functional connectivity, which massive disruption, those are like big words for scientists. We rarely use words like massive. So what shrooms seemed to do was cause desynchronization. Now, desynchronization sounds like it's a bad thing, but it's actually sometimes a good thing. So we see that there's like an over-synchronization of neurons in things like Parkinson's disease. Like maybe they are just too synchronized together. They're basically all firing at the same time, and you need something to disrupt that rhythm. And we know that like changes in synchronization are linked to how we learn. So basically what they found with shrooms are that like desynchronization occurred, which allowed those neurons, instead of just talking to like the other neurons in their own network, so instead of like being part of their own clique, it made them talk to the other neurons in other networks. So it led to that desynchrony. Now it wasn't just these neurons firing at exactly the same pattern in this area and these doing the same thing, but like everybody talking to one another. And they found that most of this desynchronization occurred in that default mode network, the one that I was talking about linked to mind wandering earlier. And also, intriguingly, that default mode network is linked to things like our perception of time and space. And so if you thought about what might happen if you severely disrupt the area that's linked to time and space, yeah, it leads to you not knowing where you exist, you feeling like you are out of the bounds of reality. And that's what a lot of people say on psilocybin. And the more they felt those feelings of connectedness and the transcendence of space and time, the more they actually had those patterns of desynchronization. And yeah, they saw these same changes in desynchronization weeks after their experience with psilocybin. So like a single dose weeks later still caused the desynchronization in areas like the default mode network. So now for the tuning in part. They saw that desynchronization of the brain was linked to kind of like more flexibility. And this is the idea behind one of the theories known as entropic brain, another great band name. So entropy is like a system moving more towards chaos. And they're basically saying that like the brain moving more towards desynchrony or more towards chaos is actually good. Like that makes it more flexible and adaptable. And that might be linked to like why people who are taking psilocybin might have reductions in things like depression and anxiety. And so to look more into this desynchronization, they basically gave 62 people, again, shrooms, and then looked at them when they were doing 4 different things. So they were resting, basically doing nothing. They were meditating, they were listening to music, or they were watching a video. And they did like a series of brain scans. So here they're looking at an MRI, so kind of real-time activity, as well as an EEG. So that provides like patterns of brainwave activity. And they looked at these in the people in the 4 different conditions and then fed this through what is known as machine learning. So they basically used a computer to see if there were any patterns that they could not see. So they found that under both the eyes open and eyes closed conditions, usually you see a lot of patterns of brain activity that are like synchronized together. What they found was that there's a desynchrony there. So the external and the internal worlds were kind of not separated anymore. They were like integrated. And so the words that these scientists used specifically were embedded. So people felt embedded or like more integrated or continuous with their environment. So basically it seemed that shrooms produced this like lack of boundaries. So instead of having like, this is how I'm feeling internally and this is the external world and see how they line up, like they kind of like blurred the boundaries between the two. So shrooms led both to be embedded in one another. And so people actually kind of felt more connected with the environment because of patterns of desynchronization in their brainwaves. The external and the internal were no longer separate. And they could actually tell which environments people were in based on their brainwave activity, suggesting that their brainwave activity was like kind of taking the external and making it part of the internal and making the internal more part of the external, again, blurring those boundaries. And in doing so, it kind of felt more connected to everything because it wasn't just one or the other, it was both at the same time. Now we need much more information here. This is one study published a week ago. Now it was published in Nature, which is like one of the best journals out there for scientists. So it is a well done experiment. And the study is really, really good, but we don't have a ton of information. This is just one hypothesis that's out there. But this is leading us into areas that could really benefit from kind of some new ideas. So this might be changing how we think about things like depression and anxiety. Like maybe desynchronization is something we should look into more instead of just like neurotransmitter systems. And this might help us explore things like mystical experiences and consciousness and that feeling of being part of something that's really hard to verbalize sometimes. So yes, it's new and yes, it's exciting. And hopefully this helped to kind of demystify what is actually going on with some of the mystical psychedelics out there.